Happy New Year's, everyone. I'm KMBest. I hosted a tournament technically last year. Let's take a look at the top 8 decks from my very recent, even though it was last year, tournament. Starting with the winner under the name of John Doe, a ramp deck that actually, according to the winner, came directly from my video on what decks to play to win my tournament. Sometimes I actually do nail those recommendations. The idea behind the ramp deck has always been pretty consistent. What we want to do with this deck is to access as much of our power as we can while maintaining our ability as the only deck in the metagame to play the high impact tech cards. Now, I know we're not a Shadow King deck, and it's very easy to argue Shadow King is the highest impact tech card, but there's very little in terms of situations that come up in Marvel Snap that one of Legion, Enchantress, or Cosmic Ghost Rider will not meaningfully answer. You need to be playing against something that is very specifically able to do a ton of points that is unrelated to the text on the card. I think perhaps Enchantress was not at her best in this tournament format. If you recall, we had a deck building restriction requiring people to play cards from the most recent 3 seasons, which actually made it pretty difficult to play an ongoing deck. But just having access to her as a way to turn off your Electro, I think, is a really underrated thing about this deck. A dynamic that it shares in common with the old Surtur decks was that it gets to be able to free roll this tech card, because this tech card is also upside for it. It's not your best answer to Electro, but it is an absolutely fine one if you feel the need to make sure that you are actually able to play cards later in the game. And there's just enough little bits of ongoing that a 5/8 that you get to play on turn 4 is very often a functional piece of what you're doing. This is a powerful deck. The thing that makes it so powerful is its ability to attack 2 lanes with very high density of threat. This is very often going to be a deck where you have 4 things on a lane and none of them are smaller than 7 power, and many of them are much larger than 7 power. Chamber, of course, an extremely powerful card that really adds to the threat density in this list. You are extremely able to get about 30-something power in one lane and then have, let's say, 27 for Infinaut Ebony Maw to distribute wherever you want on the final turn of the game, which just is a winning formula. This is a deck that plays only big things, so whatever lanes your opponents allow you to go into, that's something you should be paying attention to the entire game. What lanes are they committing weak early bodies to? Are those lanes you're going to be able to pick up late with a big Infinaut because of the amount of early weak commits they've made? That's the kind of stuff you've got to be thinking about when you play this list. What is their maximum power across 4 spaces? Is it below what you can do across those 4 spaces while still maintaining a powerful and flexible turn 6? That's kind of the questions you got to ask yourself when you play a deck like this. Extremely strong deck, extremely good performance here. Totally unsurprising to me that it was able to be as good as it was. In second place was a Ben Roller special. For those who aren't familiar with Ben, he hosts a podcast with Lauren Whatevs and another friend of theirs, which I have actually guested on. Very cool podcast. Check it out. Make sure when you look at this deck, though, that you understand what it is and not what it isn't. I think a lot of people are going to look at this deck and say, okay, I get it, it's a Cannonball deck. But I honestly think that in a lot of matchups, the worst part about this deck is a Cannonball deck. What I see is that this is a Maverick deck, and I'll tell you what else. The card I was the most impressed with in the entire list was Hope Summers, who was really just doing a ton of work with the Merlin addition here, allowing this deck to make tons of weirdly powerful plays that allowed a ton of output. I was very impressed with her, and I didn't expect myself to be. What this deck is able to do is really, really legitimately strong. It has so many ways of sort of stacking buffs that multiply with themselves. You buff a Maverick, the Maverick buffs something else. That something else that it buffs is probably going to be a card that multiplies that buff inherently, something like a Brood or a Captain Carter. All of your buffs are multiplicative. They keep stacking and stacking and stacking, and you just output a ton of points. When I looked at the stats, I was pretty surprised by how few people were Maverick gamers in this entire tournament. I believe only 4 people brought the card. Of those 4 people, 2 of them made the top 8. And this is why I keep consistently telling people that Maverick is just a much better deck than people give it credit for. I think people think of it as just like, oh, the new card came out. It's like a tier 2-ish deck. You know, it's like the same as Aurora or whatever. No, This is a really strong deck that is only being held back by multiple dominant decks having naturally powerful tech cards against it. And even then, I would argue not necessarily being held back as much as you think. For example, we have Cosmic Ghost Rider with the ability to get rid of your Maverick plays. That's a really strong thing to do against you. We have, of course, Deafening Chord, able to get rid of your Maverick, able to get rid of really anything in this deck. We have, of course, the fact that everyone is playing Shadow King. All of your outputs are green power. There's a lot of answers to what this deck is doing. And it's still one of the strongest decks in the game. This is as hostile as a metagame gets for a deck like this, short of it being fully unplayable due to not reaching a point cap. That's not happening. It's just a bunch of hostile tech, and this is still an extremely powerful archetype. I really cannot stress enough just how good Maverick is at point output and just how underrated he seems to be. This is the best card of the last month. Maybe not my favorite. I really like Aurora. She's been really fun for me. But if you ask me which one is better, it is genuinely not close. It is Maverick. This is a tier 1 deck. This is a tier 1 archetype. There are a lot of things going against it, but the fact that there are a lot of things going against it and it's still this strong is a testament to its power. This deck is good. Full stop. Period. Now, the parts of this that I don't particularly love are totally fine to do. What I was really impressed with was the Hope Merlin stuff, but maybe that doesn't actually line up outside of the context of how this tournament specifically played out. The Cannonball stuff was a little more iffy for me. I don't see anything wrong with it. I like the fact that it gives you sort of one-size-fits-all answer to like whatever random BS. But it does sort of really tax your energy and point output when you have to do it in a way that I'm not sure is necessarily positive. It is nice to have in here. I like almost everything the deck is doing, potential exception to the Cannonball stuff. But I don't think it's the wrong idea, because you might think of Cannonball Mercury as just like this thing you're doing for the sake of doing it. It's actually kind of just a tech card where, oh, well, I don't really have an answer to that Living Tribunal, but I do have Cannonball Mercury. Like, if someone's going to do something that goes over the top of you, that's typically how a deck like this loses. You have answers to that. It's just it does a lot of damage to your own ability to put power on the board when you use them. That's largely the conflict that I see. Hope Summers goes a long way toward alleviating that. I honestly think that most of what this deck is doing is pretty correct. I think it's a really good way to build a deck. And I want to be really clear here, though. There's a lot of really good ways to build Maverick because Maverick is really, really strong. 3-4 slot number 1 to Gamer Shark playing what I think you could reasonably describe as stock mid-range. This is, I guess, the Shang-Chi is not stock, but it is sort of aimed at, I would argue, pretty clearly, a ramp deck. I'm not sure it was any good. Like, the thing about my tournament was it was open deck list. So on ladder, I think you play this and you expect them to play incorrectly into a Shang-Chi because they don't really expect you to have it. In a tournament, showing them you have the Shang-Chi makes the Shang-Chi just a whole lot worse because it just means, oh, well, I'm just not going to play my guy that's really big, then dies to Shang-Chi until later in the game. But this is sort of the modern form of tech slop. Wolf midrange was the most played deck in the tournament that I could split into archetypes. I believe there were about 20 different Wolf midrange decks. Depending on how you really want to parse that, it looked like about 20 to me. Now, this is what the deck looks like. I'm really excited to see what Xiao Lao looks like in a list like this, but largely what this deck speaks to is the incredible power of Merlin Werewolf as a mid-range points shell. As long as you're doing something with on reveals, it just ends up being the strongest mid-range points shell that you could possibly play. What this deck really lacks is competent late game. I'm not really going to dog on Sentry Annihilus so much as just say, they're fine, and this deck plays things that are way better than fine at every other point on the curve. Every other point on the curve, it's playing the best possible thing. Sentry Annihilus is just kind of there because it's a reasonable point package. The Sentry works with Merlin. You already play the Hood. It's just like it's a nice little piece to have in the deck, but also it just doesn't really get got by any tech. But by the nature of not getting got by tech, it also is just like the output is just like, all right, you know, whatever. I don't really want to play the Annihilus. I would much rather evolve the Void. I don't want to do what the Annihilus is asking me here. But I'm not really sure I have necessarily a better idea for what kind of points package to play in Dodge Tech. It's just a fairly mediocre points package. Excited for Xiao Lao in here, for sure. This is a really strong deck, just at baseline, the best combination of points and tech available in the format. Extremely powerful, I would argue one of the 3 best decks in the game. And the other 3-4 is the absolute opposite. From Death Player, a deck that is predicated entirely on cube juicing, which makes some sense in the tournament format that we chose, which cared a little bit about the cubes that you had left when you won the match. This seems like a reasonable option for doing that. But the other thing I really want to speak to about this deck is that there's a surprising amount of upside to just being a Galactus deck against this board-based combo stuff. A lot of decks, not all decks, but a lot of them are doing like setup, payoff. And if you catch them in the middle of that setup and Galactus them, they just kind of lose. Like Maverick deck, for example. Oh, I want to play a Surge. I want to play a Maverick. Okay, your opponent played a Wave. They have priority. They are going to Galactus you. You cannot win a Galactus lane. Like, that kind of thing is actually just, like, pretty powerful in terms of the dynamics here. Now, they're pretty clear that this is actually secretly a Loki deck. I saw a couple of Lokis played. I was not impressed with it. But I was very impressed with the general concept of looking at this metagame and saying, I think it's time to G-Man some people. There's just a lot of stuff that G-Man puts in a corner and makes you look stupid for even trying to do. And I think that that is just a generally powerful thing to be having access to. You have this also shockingly powerful ability to get priority with a deck like this. Like, you have Merlin, you have 3/6s. You are very often going to have prio into the Galactus turn. It's pretty common, and that's basically the most important thing you can have. Now, you do have to still win the Galactus lane, which means that against ramp decks, it can be a little bit iffy, which I assume is why we're doing this, like, Shang-Chi and Loki stuff, where it's like, oh, okay, we're a ramp deck, gotta do this other stuff. The addition of Fastball Special and Hobgoblin means that you have ways to set up Galactuses later in the game as well. Largely, I would describe this as a relatively gimmicky deck, but it does identify some interesting and powerful things that are relevant to the metagame. And specifically Galactus, I think people need to start thinking about more as a card that is not its own deck per se, but a good choice when you are able to fulfill the things that he is asking for, which is to say, have priority and be playing against a kind of setup-y spread against all 3 lanes deck. A name I can't pronounce because I don't speak, I'm guessing, Japanese, is, of course, the man who brought this Thanos list. I really appreciate seeing the devotion that APAC players have to Thanos, and I think this is a very solid and reasonable Thanos list. If you want to be trying out what Thanos Aurora looks like, it probably looks mostly exactly like this. The one thing that wigs me out about this list, though, is Strange Supreme, because a lot of the premise of playing Aurora is that, okay, I'm going to play Aurora because all my stones double up on the Aurora buff, so I'm really happy about that, and then Strange Supreme comes along and he eats your stones. Now, he is an end of turn, and that is cool, but like, okay, I build this deck to play Aurora. I'm playing all of these stones. I'm playing Sam Wilson, Captain America. Oops, they're all being eaten by Strange Supreme. They definitely don't work together very well, and that's fine. You are very okay with them not working together very well. You're just like, all right, well, that happened, but I still have like a 20 power Strange Supreme. The problem is a 20 power Strange Supreme in this environment is like Shadow King bait. So you kind of have to Cosmo that lane, and then it's like, all right, well, I need to figure out how to win another lane. There are some anti-synergies here. Largely, the idea is basically we're playing one of Aurora or Strange Supreme here. I think that's probably the right thing to do. It just doesn't make me feel good doing it. This is a very solid list, though. A second ramp list coming in from Juicy Surge at the 5 to 8 spot. This ramp list is a little weirder and probably a little weaker in exchange for having a lot more weird things happening to your opponent at the end game. When you're playing in an open decklist tournament, having this kind of juking power, Ghost Spider is a really powerful card in that context, but also things like Hulkling and Eliath, those are going to be the kind of cards that nobody is really used to playing against in a ramp deck list and make your final turns a lot less predictable, which can be really valuable when it comes to actually gaining cube equity. I think this list is likely to be, on the whole, a little bit worse than the other versions of the ramp deck, because in order to get those cards in, it's giving up on some, frankly, pretty powerful stuff. In order to get Ghost Spider in, it's giving up on Ebony Maw. In order to get Goliath and Hulkling in, it's giving up on some of the important 5-cost tech that I think is really strong, things like Cosmic Ghost Rider, Enchantress, Legion. And Giganto is in here in order to sort of give it more beef, allowing it to be a much better blink deck. This is a deck that is looking to play bigger stuff than the other ramp deck, but at the same time, if you ever actually have to use one of your turns on Goliath, you're suddenly behind again. It's an interesting idea. I largely think that it makes a decent amount of sense in the cube-based format that we had for this tournament, so it could probably make some sense on ladder as well. I personally am a fan of the Ghost Spider stuff, but that's like one of those play at your own risk things. It's not going to be as good for you as Ebony Maw unless you are very confident in how you're going to use it consistently. A lot of what I like about it is removing a big guy from a lane and then putting it in another lane, but you need to do reads if that's how you're going to actually play the game. And if you're not going to be like a read gamer, you should probably just put like 35 power in one lane and 27 in another when you play the normal version of this deck. H. Herndon with the other Maverick deck in the top 8. If I'm not mistaken, this is the exact 12th that I also recommended in my video. I think it's just a very powerful list. This is, of course, the Smiz build of Activate with Maverick, so you have multiple combos here. What this deck does very well is blend multiple things. You can be a mid-rangey Shadow King deck, or you can be a top-end big combo Jocasta Maverick deck. All of that is a very reasonable option. It's all on the table in front of you, but depending on what your hand looks like, what the matchup looks like, you get to use that to great extent in an open deck list format because you know what your opponent can and can't interact with. Is your opponent good at interacting with, say, oh, they want to throw priority and Shadow King my big lane? Okay, well, I'm going to throw priority and I'm going to play a Jocasta combo. And they're not going to be able to do anything about that. They're just going to lose to that because I threw priority. Like that kind of stuff, knowing that game plan from the first turn of the game, very important. Is your opponent the kind of deck that is able to deal with your Jocasta combo? Maybe they're playing Cosmic Ghost Rider and Deafening Chord. All right, cool. We're going to be a deck that plays a mid-rangey, let's spread points out game plan. And they're not going to be nearly as good against that. That dynamism is the biggest strength of this build of Maverick. Last up is Get Wrecked, who is a moderator of mine. He used to be really good at this game. He mostly doesn't play anymore, so this is a great result for my boy. This is a really legit deck, I think, although I think some of the specific choices are probably incorrect. The legitness of this deck is, of course, this is Merlin Werewolf. Get Wrecked's little special is playing a Dormammu in Merlin Werewolf, not for the purposes of Dormammu or really anything like that. Just have an extra spell that starts in your hand with your Werewolf by night. It's okay. There's like some built-in ability to use Dormammu. Like you have Killmonger, you have Nico Destroy, you have this ability to actually make things happen. I do want to talk about like Enchantress is probably wrong here. Not just in my tournament, which had a relative lack of ongoing, which I think you could argue whether or not that was predictable, but I think it probably was. Just in general, I'm not seeing it. I just don't think that's the right tech card for the moment here. There's probably something better. I can't say for sure what it is, but I'm fairly confident there's just a better thing to be doing with that slot. Maybe it's just a cheaper card earlier, but I'm pretty sure it's not Enchantress. It could be Cosmic Ghost Rider, but I'm pretty sure it's not Enchantress. The rest of this deck is exactly what you think it is. It's just a well-put-together points and tech machine. Another deck that I think could really use the addition of a Xiao Lao at some point in the future. Largely, this deck is very similar to the earlier version of Wolf Tech that we talked about, but instead of Shang-Chi, there's an Enchantress, and there's an additional Dormammu in order to get extra points on the Werewolf, which I think is like a pretty reasonable thing to do. The Enchantress, I don't like. The Dormammu, I think is honestly pretty solid. The rest of what this deck is doing is very similar. I do like that it has the ability to be a Killmonger deck. It's not necessarily the most relevant thing in the entire world, but it can be. And I think that's an easier ask if you're playing Dormammu and other things like this. It also, I think, pushes you a little bit away from wanting to be in a Nihilist deck because you have Merlin and Killmonger as answers to your hood, which means this deck is actually much more set up to be a Shao deck, especially with Dormammu's spell costing 0, than I think the other build of Wolf Merlin is, which is interesting and notable to me. This is a deck that I think might actually have a little bit of a future. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one.